second panel for the day. This one will be on energy and ethics. And just by a brief way of introduction of this topic, I think we have to remember that a lot of this discussion about environment, in large measure, particularly when we deal with questions like climate change, is about energy policy. This is what the political debate is about as we try to think through what type of path we can create for a new energy path that is much more sustainable. And given that we've had a panel on security this morning, we'll have one later on poverty and development. It's all folded into one. Obviously, we're treating them a bit as silos in order to, if you will, disaggregate it and provide a little more attention, but you really cannot divorce these issues from one another. And since we're using Laudato Si as somewhat of a frame here, I just want to have a brief quote from Pope Francis. Quote, "The use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal but also oil, and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. Until greater progress is made in developing widely accessible sources of renewable energy, it is legitimate to choose the lesser of two evils or to find short-term solutions." I think this sets a high but workable moral framework for trying to work toward finding a sustainable path forward with energy. I'm really delighted to have a panel that I think can help us think about both what some of the major energy policy conundrums are and also what ethical problems arise for them. Anna Unruh Cohen is the Director of Energy, Climate, and Natural Resources for Senator Edward Markey. He's the senator from Massachusetts. And she has also worked on these range of issues when she was Deputy Staff Director of the Natural Resource Committee for the Democratic staff over on the House side. Senator Markey was a longtime member of the House before he went into the Senate. And she's either well put together or herself may have an identity crisis. Unruh is Mennonite, Cohen is Jewish, and Anna's Catholic. So we have all combined in one in her. Jamie Schaefer is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Ethics at Marquette University, where she's established and directs an interdisciplinary minor in environmental ethics. And she's focused a lot on the relationship of theology and the natural sciences and technology with a real focus on ecology. I first met Jamie about almost 40 years ago when I first came to the Bishops' Conference, Catholic Bishops' Conference in 1981. And she invited me out to a debate, and my debate partner was a woman named Mary Ellen Pohl, P-O-H-L. And I said we were poles apart, B-O-L-E-S, in our views. And Mary Ellen later married and became the wife of Judge Bork. So those of you who are old enough remember the Judge Bork and some of the difficulties we might say he had on Capitol Hill. And our final panelist, or at least for introduction, is Lois Schiffer, longtime colleague and friend of Drew Christensen's. And she's worked in a number of capacities on environmental law issues, including as Assistant Attorney General at the Justice Department, Environment and Natural Resources Division under the Clinton administration, and is General Counsel at National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and she's an adjunct professor here at Georgetown University Law. So I want to welcome our panel and look forward to the discussion. I'm going to ask Anna to go first, kind of in the model that Father Zampini had. He talked about the See Judge Act model. We'll only have the see in the judge part. So we'll start kind of with, if you will, the data. Anna's with Congress in that sense, so kind of the public dimension, and then Lois will talk, more about administration, implementation, legal pieces. So Anna, general question on, the environmental problems you see, some of the ethical dimensions of this as you've experienced it over the years.
All right, well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and as you heard, it was my Sullivan grandmother whose faith tradition won out in a pretty diverse faith family tree that I have going back. So it's great to be here at Georgetown and with so many of you who actually have a much deeper understanding of Catholic theology and tradition than I do. My education is actually as an earth scientist. So I got a PhD in climate science, the Earth Science Department at Oxford, and there's a program that brings scientists to work on Capitol Hill, which is how I started first working for Senator Markey in the fall of 2001, and have basically worked for him ever since, and so been involved in essentially all of the energy and climate debates that have happened in those last 15 years. And I appreciate the point that Walt made earlier that energy and climate are intertwined. And so oftentimes I end up talking to groups about, why the comprehensive climate bill that Chairman Waxman and Markey were able to get through the House with the help of Speaker Pelosi, why that failed, why we haven't had any climate legislation. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I also always point out, we had an energy bill in 2007 that raised fuel economy standards for the first time in 30 years and has a huge climate benefit associated with it. And then as part of the 2009 Recovery Act, we had a huge investment in clean energy, which was really critical to what we've now seen as just a decade of phenomenal growth in wind and solar. So we've had those things that don't get written as about climate bills, but really are. And that's important as we go forward thinking about energy policy, that we're keeping that climate impact as a part of the discussion. So early in my career in Washington, someone said to me, politics beats substance. Well, actually, they said Trump substance, but given the current presidential debate, I am changing it in my mind to beat substance. And as a scientist who was working in policymaking, that was actually really depressing to me. But after being saddened by that for a day or two, I really took it as a call to my career to make that substance, which is science and other, how things are really happening in the world, take it as my call to make that politically relevant. And, because politics is ultimately a value decision, and, it's ultimately weighing a number of competing issues into, do I vote yes on a bill or no on a bill? And so to inform those value decisions, we have tools like science, like economics, like ethics and views of your faith tradition that all have to come together. And both for an elected official and the staff that support them, an important part of that is understanding the assumptions and limitations that go into a climate model or a cost-benefit analysis, and how we factor that in to an ultimate decision. And just, Pope Francis, I think understood that, and an important quote from Laudato Si, I'll just read briefly here, is, in the view of the common good, there is an urgent need for politics and economics to enter into a frank dialogue in the service of life, especially human life. So those of us who come from a Catholic faith tradition and the underpinning of expanding the common good, we have to understand how science and economics informs what then we ultimately decide to do as a policy with the goal of increasing the common good, which is certainly part of my motivation in my career. And just to illustrate that, when I give a longer talk, when I'm often invited to talk with science students about being a scientist who works in policy making, and I have a quote that's now a decade old from a former British MP, and he's talking about setting pollution reduction targets, and he says, the decision to set targets is not just a question of science, but of justice. And that is, I think really important for those people who especially have a technical background to understand the ethical dimension of politics, of political and policy making. And we even see that translated through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the original framework, the objective that was ratified in 1992 is to paraphrase, to prevent dangerous climate change. And through subsequent years and negotiations, the COPs that occurred in the sort of 2009, 2010, 2011 time period, so Copenhagen, Cancun, and Durban, the UN came to further define that as avoiding 2 degrees C temperature increase. And that was, informed by science and other issues. But when it comes to justice, allowing the temperature to increase that much will be an existential threat to many island nations and other coastal nations. And so now, as that understanding expanded, we came to the Paris Agreement with still the 2 degrees C component, but a pledge and a commitment to try and get as close to only a 1.5 degree increase in temperature if possible. And we all know, and we've already been mentioned, that there's a lot of work to do to even keep us from 2 degrees C. But that change in temperature, I think, really helps illustrate this interplay between what we understand the world to be through science and what that really needs to translate to for protecting people in countries and the broader creation. So in WaxmanMarkey, the bill was a comprehensive climate bill. Most people think of it as cap and trade, but it was also a lot more than that. And in particular, we went through a lot of effort because increasing the price of energy and putting a price on carbon can be very regressive and can really harm the poor and middle class families. And so we went through a lot of effort to make sure we were doing our best to try and mitigate that cost. But in addition, investing in domestic and international climate resiliency and adaptation measures. And Senator Markey likes to say, if we could put flags on pollution, you would look up and you'd see a lot of red, white, and blue CO2. So we have, as the United States, a responsibility to be helping both our own domestic communities that are vulnerable to climate change, but also the greater international scene. And so that was important. Walt was involved in including some of those provisions that would help the international community, and both in adaptation, but also funding technology transfer. And one reason we were able to have that in, and frankly to be able to pass a bill in 2009, was because of the faith community, both in setting the stage in previous years and bringing a number of people to concern about climate change, and here in particular the evangelical community ability to influence some key Republicans to support climate and to be concerned about these issues was really critical. And so we really would not have been able to pass WaxmanMarkey without expanding that coalition that included really a wide range of faith communities. But as you all know, we did not get a comprehensive climate bill to President Obama's desk. And his administration has continued to work on climate, and we'll see. After the oral arguments, I feel pretty confident the Clean Power Plan will come come into fruition here fairly soon, but it's got to go through its legal hurdles. And again, that's another place where the Catholic Church and the faith community has been important in supporting that. But up on Capitol Hill, to the extent that there is any conversation about climate policy, it really has moved away from this comprehensive approach and looking at both emissions of carbon pollution and also the impacts that we're already seeing. And so that's one thing I maybe want to leave with this audience and encourage this audience to engage on is that we really need to continue that national and international conversation on the impacts and how we deal with them. Because in order to have an equitable, to deal with those impacts equitably, we do need to have this national conversation, because otherwise we'll have rich communities that are able to protect themselves or find alternate means for water, and which will leave poor communities behind. And we can already see that in some instances of sea level rise, where communities are already thinking about investing in their own particular protections to keep their coastal property intact. And in California, because of the drought, we're seeing especially some of the poor farming communities really suffering on drinking water, and their water was already not that great, and now there's even less of it, and having to just truck it, not being able, like in Flint, not being able to drink what comes out of their taps. And those challenges will just get worse with climate change. And so that's a critical component, not just as the sort of educational book that it is, but Laudato Si really came back and raised the important issues that we should really be motivated to addressing this problem because of the impact on the poor and vulnerable communities. And those communities include non-human communities, the animals and other things that are critical to supporting human life. We need to keep those ecosystems healthy. And so it obviously made a big splash. It came out and really helped foster the conversation ahead of Paris and up on Capitol Hill. And I think the challenge now, both for continuing to foster that dialogue in the political space, but also within the church, is that continues. And I think it's important to realize that encyclicals going back to the last century, I'm not very good with the Latin, but Rerum Novarum, Novera, which was Pope Leo's encyclical on economics and labor back in just right before the turn of the 20th century, still informs Catholic teaching and our views on labor and justice in the work sphere. So my hope is that Laudato Si will see that same sort of long-term influence both in the Catholic Church and in the broader world. And I think talking about the integral ecology is one way to talk about what our goals in WaxmanMarkey were and what I think the goals of the Paris Agreement are, and I guess I should say maybe aspiration. Hopefully there'll be goals that we'll meet, but to drive that just transition of the global energy system to sustainable, affordable, and clean energy that will protect people and the planet. And to, we talked about the Pope encouraging a dialogue, and when he came to Capitol Hill, which was amazing, he had this quote to say: "I call for courageous and responsible effort to redirect our steps and to avert the most serious effects of the environmental deterioration caused by human activity. I am convinced that we can make a difference, and I have no doubt that the United States and this Congress have an important role to play." And it's certainly my honor to be trying to play the little role that I do have up there on Capitol Hill. So, thank you.
You stay here, yeah. You may stay here, Lois. Yeah.
Okay, I'm opting for the light instead of the dark so that I can see my notes. So thank you for inviting me to speak today and to talk about the important topic of ethics and public policy. While we're in a Jesuit university and have been invited to prepare by reading Pope Francis's encyclical, it bears noting that not all ethics comes from religion, and that there are many sources of values that inform our public policy, particularly in this country and certainly internationally. Therefore, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Jewish values, because I'm an environmentalist and a Jew, and then a little bit about my concerns for relying on religious values in a public policy marketplace, though I completely recognize and support what Anna's talked about by way of the religious communities being involved in public policy. But I think that we also need to think about what it means in terms of persuading people and coming to common ground to make public policy. And then I will finally, of course, address the questions of energy and the environment and public policy. That's the core of the talk here. So I'm a Jew and environmentalist, and for some years I was involved with an organization called the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, which was a group whose mission was to deepen the Jewish community's commitment to the stewardship of creation and mobilize the resources of Jewish life and learning to protect the earth, and it joined in partnership with organizations from other faiths to really bring a faith-based energy into public policy. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not well-versed in Jewish theology in detail. What I am is particularly interested in the intersection of religion and public policy, both its opportunities and the difficulties that it brings, and that's really what I'll focus on today. So in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that there's a huge literature on Jews, Judaism, and environmental protection. If you Google, you will get literally millions of entries. And so I have to say that I speak only for myself and only from my own point of view. I do not speak for the Jewish community. I do not speak for the government agencies that I work for, but I hope it's a somewhat informed discussion that I give to you. So first, what is the connection between Judaism and the environment? And I think as you hear this, you can think about your own faith tradition. Many of the people in this room are obviously Catholic, but perhaps not everybody. But I think it's also helpful to think about it in terms of the faith traditions or lack of faith traditions of Americans. I mean, we are a very diverse country. We are founded on the concept of separation of church and state. We have many, many different religious points of view as well as points of view of non-religious ethics, and it's important to think about that as well. So there are 5 good reasons, at least, why Jews care about the environment rooted in Jewish tradition and practice. Our commitment to stewardship of land and nature, our concern for future generations, our commitment to community, the spiritual comfort we get from the environment, and our commitment to Tikun Olam, which is the Hebrew word for heal the world. Now, there are many ways to identify and categorize why Jews might care about the environment. This is my own 5. You can find many others. But this is sort of, to me, a handy way to think about it. Let me very briefly touch on where these values come from. So a commitment to stewardship. The Torah, which is what some call the 5 books of Moses, is filled with teachings about stewarding our lands, species, and other natural resources. A few that I think are interesting. Genesis says that God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and look after it. Exodus exhorts, but the 7th year thou shalt let your land rest and lie fallow, and it goes on. For the Jubilee, or 7 years of 7, you leave it fallow for a year. The idea is that there's a time of renewal of the land as well as of people. And the Midrash, which is a source of rabbinic lore, teaches when God created the first man, he took him around to all the trees in the Garden of Eden and said to him, "See my handiwork, how beautiful and choice they are. Be careful not to ruin and destroy my world, for if you do ruin it, there was no one to repair it after you." It goes on, there are more, but the general message that we have an obligation to care for and tend the land and protect it and the species and the air and water in it is a clear message. Concerning the future generations, which is put in religious teaching as from generation to generation, and there's a Hebrew word for that. There's a very important prayer called the Kedusha, which means holiness. And it translates into the Jewish religion being rooted in the tradition of transmitting values from generation to generation and of protecting future generations. And I think it's fair to say this is a principle of most religions and most value systems. A story from the Talmud, which is another important interpretation of Jewish law because it's such a good story, is a pious person was walking on the road. He saw a man planting a carob tree. He asked the man, how long until that tree will produce fruit? He answered that it will take 70 years. The walker said to him, are you sure that you'll still be around in 70 years? And the man replied, just as my fathers planted for me, so will I plant for my children. So the concept of we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children, is certainly well entrenched in the Jewish religion, and the idea of we need to pay attention to what we're doing from generation to generation is a crucial one. The third principle or ethic, I would say, is commitment to community. And it's, in a way, as I was thinking about this, I thought this is another way of saying public policy, because after all, what is public policy but a way of the community in some fashion coming together and saying, this is how we're going to govern ourselves, this is what we're going to do. Jews speak of ourselves as a community, the Jewish community, of our synagogue, of Washington, of the United States, and of the world. It's an integral part of the Jewish tradition to act as a community, and the Torah is filled with examples of community building. For example, the wandering of the Israelites in the desert after Egypt and before entering Israel, they became a community. They went into Israel. In the United States, we certainly have our concept of the Jewish community. I will acknowledge it is a very diverse community. Not everybody agrees with everything about one about everything, but I think that is a sense of values that people carry into their work and into public policy. A component of the concept of community is the idea of environmental justice, and we've talked about that here by way of talking about climate change and poor people. Environmental justice, I think, also means people of color and other disadvantaged and communities that don't always get a seat at the table, and I think we need to pay attention to them too. Fourth, the environment is a source of moral and spiritual comfort, and that is very personal to people. It's certainly in many parts of the Bible. The Song of Songs talks about in times of joy, the rains are over, the blossoms have appeared in the land. And most of the people in this room who have had some death in their family know about the 23rd Psalm. God makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. That is certainly a message of using nature and the land for moral and spiritual comfort. And while that would seem to be less connected to public policy, I think it resonates with people that, after all, they want nature there when they want to be a part of it. And finally is Tikun Olam, or Heal the World, which is really the clarion call for Jews to take action. So I would say those are 5 important values that inform the way that the Jews and the Jewish community can take to public policy and think about public policy. Now, before I turn to climate change, I want to mention briefly my own discomfort with bringing some of these values, insofar as they are religious values, into a public policy. I've spoken of Jewish values that encourage Jews to be involved and to take action to protect and improve our environment, but I continue with my own struggle about religion driving public policy. We have here all talked about the Pope's encyclical, which my guess is there's great enthusiasm about in this room, seems fair to say. But there are others we may not be so enthusiastic about from this faith tradition or others. What happens when people moved by their religious faiths have diametrically opposite points of view of sound public policy based on the principles of those faiths? My religion says do X and yours says do not X. Because of the nature of religious values that are not so negotiable, how do we then reach the kind of agreement and common ground and compromise that really has to drive the development of our nation's laws and the public policy they reflect? How do we encourage action, yet separate church and state, which is a key value of our country's finding? And this is a hard problem. I don't have an easy answer to this problem. I think we all sit here and are very moved by, as certainly am I, the Pope's encyclical that's viewed as on climate change and its call to action and its move to action. But there are certainly principles of the Catholic Church with which I strongly disagree. And I think that if we are talking about saying that we're going to use those religious values to drive public policy, we have to take on the fact that we might not agree with all of those values. I've done a little bit of reading about it, and of course different people have different ways they put it, but I think that one of the most thoughtful was actually from Senator Obama, before he became President Obama, when he wrote The Audacity of Hope. And because I think this is a question that is of concern, I'm going to read this short paragraph. He states, I'm somewhat eliding it, but this is mostly a quote, what our deliberative pluralistic democracy does demand is that the religiously motivated translate their concerns into universal rather than religion-specific values. It requires that their proposals must be subject to argument and amenable to reason. If I want others to listen to me, then I have to explain why what I advocate violates some principle that is accessible to people of all faiths, including those with no faith at all. But in a pluralistic democracy, we have no choice. Almost by definition, faith and reason operate in different domains and involve different paths to discerning the truth. So as I outline here how Jewish values have propelled the Jewish community and individual Jews to take action for environmental protection and have given environmentalists a reason to renew their commitment to Judaism, I struggle with this question of how to use religious values to form American public policy. And I think we all have to think about that and ask, as we come to environmental policy from action based on faith-driven values, as a nation and a world, how we create that bridge between them. Now let me turn briefly, in my probably not so remaining time, to the question of climate change and energy policy that were posed to this panel. And the first thing I want to say is, I think that indeed climate change is inextricably linked with energy policy, and I certainly agree with Anna that paying attention to how we're going to have a climate change bill is going to heavily take into account energy policy. But that's not all it does, and I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that climate change has an impact on clean air and clean water, as she noted, on species, on the nature of our land, and that we have to remember that environmental issues are informed by, but broader than, climate change and energy policy as we move forward. Now, what about energy policy? So I'm in the Obama administration. Clearly, President Obama has made a high priority doing something about climate change as a significant threat to our way of life and to our planet, the planet that we care about so much. And I think that based on the values that I described earlier of stewardship and community and generation to generation, that we can be very motivated to take action on the basis of climate change, action to begin to address climate change, but frame it in a way that, motivated by those religious values, nevertheless recognizes that we have common ground in this environment in a way that we can talk across religious values and in a secular way as well. We were asked questions about, do these moral and ethical teachings mean that we have to pay attention to mitigation and adaptation, and clearly they do. How do we get poor countries and communities involved and explain or make it appealing to them that they don't have to go through a dirty fuel phase, as they would say we in the US have done, before they can get to a clean fuel phase. And it has seemed to me, based in part on the values that I've described, that we need to continue to find ways to make clear that we're all linked together. That, in other words, I don't just preach to somebody, don't have to just preach to someone in a developing country, you shouldn't use coal because it's bad for us, but make clear, because it's bad for all of us, for that country to use coal, that we build in incentives in the developed world that make us want to provide or find it worthwhile to provide technology and planting of trees and other means to people in developing countries. So that, to me, the approach in looking at climate change and energy policy is to take into account that we are one big community, in a sense, that we have to stand on the common ground of our environment, and we have to think about and find ways in public policy well beyond our own country to act on that principle of a broad community. So I will end with one quote and then look very much forward to the discussion and questions. And that is there's a Jewish text that quotes a rabbi named Rabbi Tarfon, and it's a famous quote where he said, we are not obligated to complete the task, and I would think that for everyone in this room, we will not complete the task of fixing climate change in our lifetime, but neither are we free from abstaining from it. So we have to all act together to see what we can do to make progress based on the values that motivate us and the ways we can persuade people.
Thank you. Jamie?
Well, thanks, Walt, and thank you, Lois and Anna. I teach religious foundations for ecological ethics. I'm teaching it this semester at Marquette University, and I have to say, I found in my research, and I found in dealing with other scholars of the world religions, wonderful sources, nuanced sources within each religious tradition that can be drawn upon to address many of the ecological problems that Pope Francis does talk about, identifies as needing to be addressed by all people. And why? We have that ability from different religious traditions to address our common home. And so his appeal then is to all people. Now, prior to Pope Francis, we had Patriarch Bartholomew, the Green Patriarch, making a similar appeal to people of all religions. So what I did when I received my questions from Drew, we received our questions from Drew, and I picked out the ones that were most appropriate for an ethicist to address. I picked out what are the basic values in contention, and I was thinking about not only our Abrahamic traditions, but I was thinking about other world religions as well. And then, is there a duty to move away from fossil fuels, obligation duty? And the other question that was highly appropriate for me, do affluent nations have any obligation to help pay for or share the technologies that poorer nations need to leapfrog this stage of fossil fuel development? So, and then I'd like to close with sharing a project that's underway that's looking at the collaboration of religious communities and scientists, and tell you about it, because I think it's going to be appropriate for you to know about this and know about this happening. So what are some of the basic values that we're dealing with here? And again, these are shared in the Abrahamic religions and in many of the world religions that I study with my students. I think basically, from the perspective of our common home, do we value other people? Do we value people who are within our local communities? Do we value them in larger communities, bioregions, I would prefer to say? Do we value people throughout the world? Do we value future generations of people? So I think that's a huge issue that we all have to grapple with when we're dealing with making policy that knows no political boundaries, essentially, making policies for our common home, which does not know political boundaries, but yet we have to make policy from within the political boundaries that we are actually trying to address or trying to see some kind of effective action. Another value is, do we value other species? Do we value ecological systems? Do we value the marginal areas? Do we value the biosphere? You know? And this is a huge question for all of us, because too often we think about valuing people, or we're anthropocentric in our valuing. But we have to realize in this common home, we share this common home, this wonderful earth, with so many other species and abiota and ecological systems. And I was astounded when reading Laudato Si and then hearing Pope Francis repeat this in his address to the General Assembly of the United Nations. He used terminology that's used widely in the environmental philosophy literature. He wrote and he said that we need to value other species and systems and our common home intrinsically. That is, in and of and for themselves, aside from our own use of them. So that term intrinsic is very important to recognize. This is a movement ahead, a movement beyond, and a connection also with the secular literature, the environmental philosophy literature. So we have to deal with those questions of valuing. And then we have to ask this question of ourselves. Do we value ourselves, our dignity as human persons, for acting responsibly and accounting for our actions, and then addressing what we have done wrong for our irresponsibility? Do we value our own human dignity to have that capability? And sometimes we don't. Sometimes we think problems are so big that we're not going to address them. But we do have, and I can say this for the Catholic theological tradition, we do have a principle of subsidiarity whereby we think of ourselves as acting as locally as we possibly can at the individual level. And when we can't completely address the issue at that level, we move incrementally up. When we're dealing with a lot of these problems that Pope Francis points to in Laudato Si, including climate change, we have to work concurrently at all those levels, every one of those levels. And we have to also accept our responsibility as people, human beings. At least in the Catholic tradition, we talk about ourselves as there's dignity and life for the human person that must be respected. We have to think about the kind of planet that we will be leaving behind. For some of us, for our grandchildren and their grandchildren, or for others, nieces and nephews, but our own relatives. And then when we expand this purview of relatedness, we can talk about our relatedness to all people into the future, but also other species and systems and the biosphere of our planetary home into the future. So we need to think about how we value ourselves as intending to do whatever we can to leave a life-flourishing planet. I don't even like to use the term sustainability anymore. A life flourishing or a planetary flourishing for the future. Now, this is really a value. This is a responsibility, an obligation that I think we have. And I think we can draw this from all the world religions. So that's something we have in common. Now, what are some of the characteristics then of us, of our species, that we would like to see demonstrated in the way in which we act? And as I went through Laudato Si, I did not see Pope Francis refer to virtues, and I don't even think, I'll have to search the document again. I don't even think he talked about characteristics. But the way in which he talked about the problems and how we were going about addressing them, or how we should go about addressing them, or at least engage in dialogue to address them, I identified a number of characteristics that have parallels with virtues that we find elevated within religious communities. And I especially hear Judaism, Islam, some of these characteristics, Buddhism, and certain sects of Hinduism as well. Of course, Jainism, the perfect environmental religion. But some of these characteristics are prudence, and this was already mentioned, making well-informed decisions. These are characteristics that I think Pope Francis is underscoring in our dialogue to address the ecological crisis. So prudence, making well-informed decisions. Justice, we've already talked about intra-generational justice, justice between human beings among ourselves. And we've also talked about intergenerational justice, being concerned about future generations. Well, I would say, what about justice for other species and systems and our common home? You know, we have to have a more expansive view of justice, both inter and intra. And those are very important characteristics. Moderation, self-restraint. Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew and Arthur Waskow at the Shalom Center, and I've worked with Arthur on a number of occasions, a superb person, as well as the folks at the Coalition for Environment on Jewish Life. Wonderful people, and Green Muslims as well. Self-restraint, moderation in what we do, curtailing our overconsumption, which only leads to abuse of other species and systems, and the air, the land, and the water, we know that. When we think especially about all these garbage islands that are out floating out in the Pacific and in the Atlantic that are so problematic and so complex in many ways. And then other characteristics of human beings that I found in Laudato Si that I thought were very important to bring to the fore and become prominent in some of the other world religions, like compassion. Pope Francis himself is the epitome of humility. We can follow that characteristic in being humble. And I would say humility is a very important characteristic for all of us to take on in light of our very late arrival in this 13.75 billion year universe, with a planet, less than half that year old. And here we emerge as a species from earlier hominids, and then way before, however life actually began in some primordial soup of some sort. Here we are, and we're here today. And we should be humble about our place in the universe. And I would say when we talk about valuing our own sense of responsibility for ourselves and how we act, this is one way in indicating our dignity by being humble. So that's how I'm taking that characteristic that surfaces loudly for me in Laudato Si and the way in which Pope Francis conducts himself. To be respectful of others, other people, but also other species. To be cooperative, he uses this wonderful term that I use that a lot from Thomas Aquinas. Are cooperating with one another, but also are cooperating with other species and systems in this biosphere, into which we are all related. And we know that's the constant refrain in Pope Francis's Laudato Si. All are related. Everything is connected. I mean, that's his mantra in Laudato Si. To be protective. And he used, when he was installed as Pope, he used St. Joseph to point to the protectiveness that we should be emulating in our own behavior. Protectiveness of our common home. Protective of other people, other species, other systems. To be courageous in taking a stand and speaking up in the common arena from our faith perspectives, but speaking up over a common concern that we have, and that is our planet and its ability to sustain life, to flourish into the future. And that's what we have at stake with us today. That's what we're grappling with today. So, well, I could go on with some more characteristics that have parallels in the virtues of some of our religious traditions, but let me move on to the inevitable answer to my question. You'll know how I'm going to answer this. Do we have a duty to move away from fossil fuels? Well, most definitely we have a duty, because we know that the greenhouse gas emissions are threatening a life-impoverished planet into the future. And we simply have to move away from fossil fuels, move away from greenhouse gases, move toward energy efficiency strategies, move toward renewable energy sources. And we are making some effort in that direction, but we have a long way to go, and we have to do it quickly. Right now, I will say, however, we cannot move ahead with other strategies and employ more nuclear power plants in the meantime. We simply cannot do that. We have had over 60 years of nuclear power generated electricity. We have highly radioactive spent fuel that's stored in nuclear power plants around the country. The power plant storage pools have run out of space. They're putting some of the older spent fuel assemblies out on concrete slabs so that the heat and the heat can dissipate. But I wonder about the radiation. It's supposed to be decreasing within, but it's out there, and we simply cannot go ahead with more nuclear power as even a stopgap as we move away from fossil fuels. We cannot, because we have an obligation to present and future generations to address that issue before moving ahead with any more nuclear. All right, do affluent nations have any obligation to help pay for or share the technologies poorer nations need to leapfrog the stage of fossil fuel development at this stage? Unquestionably. Here we are, the United States, other nations, China, other nations, have generated the largest quantities of greenhouse gases. We have a responsibility to help mitigate these greenhouse gases. We have a responsibility to help poorer nations adapt to the causes, the problems that we are creating with the emissions of greenhouse gases. And we need to get on with sharing that technology, and we need to be very generous toward that. Well, my time is way up, and so if anybody's interested in knowing what I want to share with you about how religious communities and scientific communities are in the process of attempting to collaborate, I would be very happy to answer that question.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask just one question, then open it up to the audience to make up a little bit of time from earlier. A couple of observations. So Anna said, at one point, it's not about science, it's about justice, and we know how difficult it's been just to talk to people about science. It doesn't seem to move them at the end of the day. And Lois has talked about really this larger role of what's the place of religion in the public square, and the necessity of trying to translate some of that into language and values that are more universal or common or persuadable rather than from authority. I'm a religious figure, therefore you must kind of approach. And Jamie has opened up asking these fundamental questions about what we care about and in language that should resonate across broader lines, but also using ethics as you do make conclusions based on ethics. It's not just about asking questions. You've got to make a decision at some point, as tough as they may be. So one question I would have, well, the question is, particularly in terms of policy making, and then Jamie, you do judgments. So you hear from business, you hear from the environmental community, you hear from the faith community, you hear from consumers, you hear from all sorts of stakeholders when you're crafting policy, let's say Congress, or implementing policy at the administrative level. How do you weigh these competing values? Or maybe I'm just wrong. Some people, it looks like a lot we use something like cost-benefit analysis or something at the end of the day. And so I'm just wondering how all these mishmash of values, how you can help with these stakeholders, because each of them has a vision of this is the common good from business, this is the common good from environment, and often they're, as we know, they're just not in sync. So Anna, we started with you. Why don't we start? And I'll just ask each of you, and then open it up to the
Sure.
audience.
There's a saying in Washington that if you're not at the table, or at least on Capitol Hill, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so part of the challenge in policymaking, and especially doing a big bill like WaxmanMarkey, was was getting everybody at the table. And actually one reason we were able to pass a bill in 2009 is we had really reached a point in time where, we had a large contingent from the environmental community, the faith community, others saying, this is a, existential threat to America and the world, and you need to take action. And on the other side, we had business, and especially the electric utilities, who need to upgrade make capital investments in their facilities. And Wall Street was saying, no, we're not going to give you any money till we know what the path is on carbon policy. And so we had a sort of forcing moment that brought all of those voices to the table. And I mean, when it comes to Capitol Hill, it's about putting together something that gets the majority of the votes, gets to 218. And so, we had a foundation of support that we could move forward on. And then, a lot of it is just what is impacting your constituency, what's important to you, how can we deal with that problem. And, that's what we did in 2009. And I mean, a lot of those issues will come back and continue about how we deal with poorer communities on electricity, energy price increases and all of those things. So it won't be there'll be new questions, but there'll be a lot of ones that we've already worked on. So hopefully we can pull out some of that work from the last time.
So I guess I would add a few things. I never heard that expression about on the menu, but there are sometimes people who are just voiceless. I mean, they aren't at the table, and they're people who don't know. They're poor people. I mean, they're people who, some poor people have speakers for them, but many don't. And I think one of the things that's especially important is to look around and see who's not there and figure out how you're going to take those views and values into account as well. That's one thing. Secondly, my basic life view is action happens at deadlines, and in some sense there was some time imperative on that legislation, which was helpful. And we've now had a long period of kind of floundering around and no really forcing events. Paris was a forcing event, and what we did is get public policy that wasn't based on congressional action. It was a deadline. So that's not a ethical or value principle. It is something that I can say from many years of, among other things, litigating cases is very helpful to have. You have to go to court. It doesn't matter. You better get a position before you go. And so the more that can get built in, I think the better it is. The final thing I would say is that some of it relates to how you frame questions and how you think about questions. So for many years it was, we can either have a sound environment or a sound economy. You can't have both because environmental protection is so expensive. It's a nuts way to frame things. I mean, the truth of it is environmental protection and a sound economy go hand in glove, and good environmental protection creates all kinds of jobs, and bad environmental protection hurts all kinds of economies. And so it may be who's going to bear the economic cost that's a question, but in terms of the fact that these are at odds with each other, it isn't a very effective way to frame it, and I don't think it's a very honest way to frame it. And so some of it is really thinking about how are we talking about things and how are people thinking about things, because sometimes if you can move off of the he said, she said, and move it into a more collaborative framework, you can make progress too.
Dialogue. Jamie?
Well, my only reaction to that question is my hope that legislators, policymakers will listen, actually listen, and be very much aware of any vested interests that people might have who are advocating for a certain policy. That's always a concern among people of religious communities with whom I have worked in the past. And some have expressed to me, well, I'm not going to, my opinion is not going to mean anything because the opinions of lobbyists and so forth will be the opinions that will be listened to. And we know that to be a fact. Some of the studies will come out and show that to be a fact. So my hope is that, at least among policymakers, that they will seriously listen to religionists as they come to advocate out of these interests, these values that they share, the values that they would put in the terminology, the languages, the nuances particular to their religious tradition. Some legislators who share that tradition, and Anna, you mentioned the evangelicals and how effective they are coming to the Hill. And I know there are some other religious groups that come to the Hill also to advocate. And to be open to what they have to say, and then to know that they are reaching their own legislators especially, is very important. And you've already said that they were very helpful. The evangelicals were helpful in working on this climate bill. So hopefully that will continue. Hopefully you will get other religions who will be active. I know the Green Muslims are very interested in this as well. So.
Can I add just two quick things? I mean, just to underscore, we would not have had the commitment to the international community in WaxmanMarkey without the religious community. I mean, they were really the voice at the table for that. And then on the other hand, we had a really active youth advocates and organization hammering on us really, especially on those targets, because they're the ones who are gonna have to live with it. And those of us, I had my daughter in February of 2009. So, you know, I had a connection to somebody who will very likely be alive in 2100. And so, you know, that connection to the rest of the century, you know, is motivating to me. So.
And we do know that religious communities were very active as NGOs outside of Paris during COP21. And so we do know that they were effective. And some of the small island developing nations acknowledge that. The head of the Philippine delegation had mentioned that as well. So
I'm going to open it up and just identify yourself.
We can't see. So.
We can't, because we can't see. You're the anonymous audience.
It'll come on.
Okay. My name's Dane Ratliff from the Emory and Henry College.
It's not on, Mike.
There.
Okay.
There we
Now?
go.
Good, thanks. Fantastic presentation. My name is Dane Ratliff from Emory and Henry College. And one word that came up a lot in all three presentations was the word common. And both in Laudato Si, where the Pope talks about the climate being a common good, and in the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and in the Paris Agreement, we, for whom the bell tolls, in the Paris Agreement, there's a statement that climate change is the common concern of humankind, and parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, et cetera, as well as gender equality, empowerment, and intergenerational equity. So for me, that's really the locus of the ethical underpinnings of the climate change agreement. One of the problems, I think, though, that we're seeing is that there's not a whole lot of commonality as to how to make economy-wide changes that the Paris Agreement is calling for. So my question to Ms. Cohen and the others as well is really, how do you impart that ethical imperative that underpins the Paris Agreement and this common concern of humankind to a Congress that, you know, is very loath to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies that the G20 committed to phasing out way back in 2009, but has made almost no progress on. So, you know, there's, on the one hand, in the MEAs, we have this common concern, ethical imperative, and on the other hand, in trade agreements, we often see another imperative, and so we do see somewhat of a, we still see some competition between those two, and so I'm wondering, how do we bridge that ethical gap between those?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Not easily.
Not easily.
Carefully.
Yeah, well, and in a way, we may be able to affect the change we need without actually bridging it. And so I think that comes to a little bit of the pragmatic idealism that President Kennedy, you know, sort of motivated his work. And so sometimes it's just what do we need to overcome those obstacles? Who are the best messengers? Why does that, you know, why would that senator or member care and hone in on what's going to really move them to action or move them to at least agreeing to go forward and cut a deal to put in place some national policy. And I think you can see that in a lot of the social movements of the past, in particular the civil rights movement, where much like climate change, we have, we talk about the public, but obviously the public are a lot of different segments. So both in climate change and civil rights, you had some very vocal advocates for change that were a relatively small component of the national population, and you had some very vocal opponents of change who were also a relatively small part of the population. And what tipped us into action in the 60s was really getting the attention of what I don't mean in any disparaging way, but is sort of the mushy middle of the country that isn't, it's not impacting their day-to-day life. They're not really paying attention and getting enough of them concerned about the issue and ready to pressure. And we had, the same, earlier we talked about, the canon of sort of environmental law that came in the 1970s. It was sort of very familiar or similar activities that happened that, you had some strong advocates on either side, and then some things that really captured the public imagination and drove us to action. I would say in both of those instances, we had a very different political and media landscape than we do now. And if you look at there's a really great study that looks at how members of the House voted and kind of across party lines, and in starting in the late 60s and then really going through the early 80s, which is when we put the Superfund law in act. There was a lot of people in the middle, and now if you look since the early 80s, that has really just, it's sort of two separate entities. And overcoming that is frankly a big part. If you care about environmental policy and other policies, you also have to care about how our elections impact how Congress is working as well. So,
I would just add, and which is really just elaborating on what Anna said, that the studies I've seen, environment was a completely bipartisan issue. There were as many Republicans as Democrats in the late 60s and early 70s, and the congressional leaders are both. And then that's just gone completely different. It's become a highly politicized issue, and we somehow have to go back, I think. I don't have a recipe for that, but we have to find a way to go back to having it be a more common ground issue. The other thing is, I think that we've suffered terribly from the idea that government is the problem, not the solution, and that if we do not somehow do a better job of educating for citizenship and really having people understand that the government is us and that it is our public policy and how we make things happen all of ourselves, that we are in for continuing problems on that front.
I'll take two more questions at the same time, and then I think we'll have to stop. So there's one here and one from Father Zampini.
Let me just follow up a little bit. You mentioned the two energy bills that were passed in, I believe, 2005 and 2007, and you didn't go in as much detail as you might have. They were very bipartisan. George Bush signed off on it. Nancy Pelosi signed off on it. They were the source of the ratcheting up of automobile efficiency standards and new light bulbs and other things that were once kind of controversial. I wondered if you could talk about that, because I got the impression that if you didn't call it climate change but called it something else, you could build a bipartisan coalition even in this decade.
Okay, and a question from Father Zampini here.
I have a question. I completely agree with the problems of religions driving public policies. But one of the things that we are excited about Laudato Si is that the Pope is introducing the Catholic faith, at least, not as imposing, but as proposing some values. But the question is, we also struggle with the narrative of Genesis 1, So I don't want Professor Louise Schiffer to speak about all Jewish tradition, but at least about her comment about we struggle, for example, because in Genesis 1, the text says, God blessed them, men and women, and said, be fruitful and increase in number, which is already a problem, for fill the earth and subdue it. And even the Hebrew word is walk over, domination. So the Pope had to clarify the Catholic interpretation of what does it mean to subdue it or to be the masters, etc. He doesn't mention at all the problem of increasing number because for obvious reasons. But what is this do you have any similar discussion among the Jewish tradition of the interpretation of, because the Christians, arguably, during centuries, we were part of the problem as interpreting this as we can do whatever we want, based on religious values. Do you have any thoughts from the Jewish tradition about this? And another question, if I may, is to Professor Jamie. It's about, you mentioned all the values that can be presented from different perspectives and different religious traditions. I completely agree with that. But most of the values that you mentioned are individual values, are values as people. And one of the messages of Laudato Si is that there are some crucial problems that are structural. And with the personal values, it's not enough. Do you have can you develop a little bit more, how can we translate values with the structural problems?
So, Anna, maybe you could take the
maybe
first
I'll
and second
answer
for
while
Lois
they
for
work
Jewish.
on their more challenging questions, maybe. So,
Or we'll shift.
yeah,
Right?
the 2007 energy bill was really was bipartisan in that a Democratic Congress, because at that point Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, put together a bill that then President Bush signed. And if memory serves, it was passed on relatively bipartisan vote. But it was in particular driven by increasing gas prices, gasoline prices in large part, and oil prices. And the previous 2005 energy bill was really, I would say, primarily a Republican bill. There were certainly some Democrats who supported it. But it was focused a lot more on production and how do we make it easier to produce more fossil fuels and oil in particular in the United States. And we didn't really get the fuel economy, the fuel savings, efficiency side of things until we had Democrats back in control of the two houses of Congress, and then they could come together. Not to say, I mean, the fuel economy was certainly controversial even within the Democratic caucus. We had, issues with, longstanding issues with labor and of the auto workers that, had to be overcome and negotiated out. But it really was, we had an economic driver. We had, everybody pushing about gas prices, and everybody knew they needed to have some solution to it. But there was a major policy that didn't make it in. So the House kept passing a national renewable electricity standard, which would have had a requirement for renewable electricity across the country that even though Democrats were in control in the Senate, they couldn't get the 60 votes to keep it in, and also President Bush opposed it. So, we still had negotiations, but the things that could be settled on were. And then in 2009, the stimulus, I mean, everybody knows that story. I don't think there was like one Republican vote for it, but it was, what President Obama and the Democratic Congress thought they needed to do to help in a whole host of areas, but also clean energy investment was part of it.
Lois?
Okay, I'm going to be
Explain
quick and
Genesis.
easy.
Explain
I'm
Genesis.
not a theologian. I'm sure there are many Jewish people who have studied hard that part. I don't take the Bible literally, and there's lots of contradictory material in it. So, at the same time as there is a clause about subdue the earth, there are a clause about let the land rest and things like that, and you can kind of pick and choose.
And Yeah, well, but, you know.
And as a lawyer, I would say you can make these
But as a
Waiting for that to come out, the lawyer part.
but as a systematic theologian who builds upon
You don't get that out.
who builds upon biblical scholarship, Hebrew biblical scholarship, we know fairly well that the context of that Genesis 1 story of creation, which is newer by about 4 centuries than the Genesis 2 story of creation, that context of Genesis 1 having dominion over and subduing took place as the ancient Israelites that had been dispersed in the Babylonian kingdom were coming back to take over the promised land. But always, the land is the Lord's in the Jewish tradition, and we build upon that in the Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition. The earth is always the Lord's. So it was dominion always in the name of God and representing God in that context. That's biblical scholarship. And I'd love to spend, the next half hour talking about that, but Walt is saying, no, you can't. So let me move to, and some people, just one more thing, some people have inappropriately lifted that term out of context. And Pope Francis does a pretty good job without falling into biblical exegesis and explaining what dominion is. And it really is for him caring for God's creation. So, the virtues, yes. These are usually thought of as individual characteristics that a person is trained, a child is trained by their parents or their caregivers to take on these characteristics for living well-disciplined lives in this world. Ultimately, in the Catholic theological tradition, out of love for God and love for neighbor and the desire to have to spend eternal life in the presence of God. I have been promoting, and I've done this when I've gone out to dioceses and talked with representatives of the different parishes and so forth. Why not each of you parishes take one of these virtues that Pope Francis doesn't identify as virtues, but I'm saying these characteristics show up and I say they're parallels with virtues, and dwell upon that virtue and see how you can implement that in your parish. Try it out for a year. And then all come together as a diocese and talk about these and how you can build up your own virtuous community. All right. Now, I want to extend that I'm going to leapfrog onto the national scene. It is my hope, and I've written about this, that someday, perhaps through the influence of religious communities, coming to the Hill, talking to policymakers, but acting in their own communities also, that we will actually one day become a nation that can authentically call itself a virtuous community, a grand virtuous community. That's my hope. I want to see these virtues that we've kind of pigeonholed as individual characteristics, I want to see them demonstrated collectively, and increasingly so collectively. So that's my short answer, and I'll give you an article I wrote if you're interested.
Well, I want to thank our panel for it and appreciate the contribution you made to today. Thanks.
Thank you.